we're going to be revisiting React Router. So here's my little presentation on it. Now, this is very basic and rudimentary. I wasn't anticipating having to throw this together so soon. I thought that I would have like content sooner. So this is a little, kind of thrown together within the past couple of hours. So it's going to be pretty basic, where I'm just kind of overviewing the very common React Router methods that you guys are going to be using. And I'm also going to be showcasing one of my former classmates' solution to the React Router checkpoint. So I'll get into that in a second here, but this is my presentation. All right, so we've probably seen something like this before: npm install, save it as a dependency, React Router DOM. So what this is showing is, if we're just using ES6, which we're all using ES6, this is how you would do it, right? That's what looks the most familiar to us. But then common JS models, if you didn't want to use ES6, this is another way you could do it, where const browser router equals require blah, 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 grab the dot notation off of that browser, and you're good. So basics of getting started, just make sure you install and save React Router DOM. So the number one most important thing, I'm actually not going to get into hash router because, like John said, it really lowers your SEO, which is search engine optimization. You want to make sure that Google's able to parse your entire website very quickly and without many hang-ups where it doesn't know where to go next. So the more routes and the more pages and components that Google sees, the higher chance of you being able to end up higher on a search result. So that's SEO. That's why John wanted you guys to use Browser Router. But at the core, essentially all it's doing is it's just saying, like, hey, I'm the router. You can route me throughout your entire application. What you can see here, I'll use my cursor. These are all just like keys that we don't necessarily ever see, but these are kind of like accessible if you so wished to access these things. But really all you have to do is do browser router and then open it up here, browser router, right? But over here you can also do import browser router as router, and then instead of having to write browser router every time, you can just type router. That's what I've seen the most. And these are all off of the React routes DOM. What was that package? React Router DOM documentation. So I didn't write any of this. I just kind of threw this together, talking about the most important parts of this. So there we go. So switch will be the next one, and it renders the first child of a route or redirect that matches that location. So how is this different than using just a bunch of routes? Switch is unique in that it renders a route exclusively. In contrast, every route that matches the location renders inclusively. Consider this code. So right here, you don't see anything wrapped with switch. We have, no exact paths. This is a variable. So like this is meant to have some sort of user input into that field. It's like a rec param, a request parameter. And then this one actually doesn't even have a path. So the problem with this is if we try to run this with all the different routes, it would actually run and try to render all of these routes because we don't have this very pivotal switch parent component wrapping them. So to go through this here, if the URL is /about, then about, users, and no match will all render because they match that path exactly. It's kind of odd, but if you read through this, we have a /about, which would actually hit this because this is a request parameter. And then finally, since there's no path down here, obviously that's going to be rendering as well. So this is not what we want. We want to be able to specifically say this route is going here, so on and so forth. So this design allowing us to compose routes in our apps in many ways, like sidebars, bootstrap, tabs, etc. So the fix is occasionally we only want to pick one route to render. If we're at /about, we don't want any to also match /user as the parameter or show our 404 page, which is this no match right here. Occasionally, however, we want to stick with one route to render. So if we are at /about, did I just read this? Pardon me. Occasionally, however, we want to pick one route to render. If we are at /about, we don't want to also match the user rec param or show our 404 page, right? So with switch, this is essentially how you would do it. Instead of just importing a route, you would import also switch and route, wrap all of your routes in switch, and that's going to get rid of all of those problems where it's going to try and run all of those routes as long as it makes sure that like it somehow fits within what was searched in your parameters and your URL parameters. So now that we're at /about, go away, little thing. The way that switch is going to work is it's going to start looking for a matching route. So the root path /about will match, and switch will stop right there looking for matches, and it will just render about. It doesn't keep going like how we have up here. This would just keep going. So it would keep constantly trying to do, you know, route path about user. Okay, that I'm going to render that component, and then it's going to render the next component, and so on and so forth. Switch gets rid of all that. It will just match that path exactly, and the moment it hits that like if statement, if you want to think of it that way, that's when it executes the code and it just returns it then and there. You don't have to worry about it parsing through all of your routes and trying to load all the ones that match up. And then typically you'll see this. I have my finger on the, so let me go back. Typically, when you see something like this, route exact path / what that's doing is when you load up your React app, typically it loads up at localhost 8000 /, right? So a smart thing they did here is as long as that exact path matches that / then just generate the component home. So it's like the moment you spin up your server, as long as it's matching that exact path, it'll actually bring you to the component of home. So that's obviously your home page. And then if you want to go to about, then you can render the component about with the user parameter, pass it in, so on and so forth. So any questions about that? I know it's kind of confusing right now, but I do have a working example for you guys where I could show you what that actually looks like in a project. But any questions so far? Doing good? All right, so links are significantly less complicated than routes, because with routes, typically you want to have that in your app, and then you'll have a switch wrapping all of the possible routes within your app. With link, you typically want to do links with like nav bars, because those are actually going to just be a link. So like up here, we've all seen this when we see like the about or whatever, but this isn't a route, it's just a link to hit that point. And then in our app, what will happen is it's like, oh, right here you have /about, so I'm going to, run this so that way we render this component. So you want to have your routes, again, like here with switch and your like app .js. But if you have a top nav, like a React component, then you'd want to use links, so that way when you click on the link, it actually goes to the app and it tries to hit that route within that switch statement. And then right here, route component is perhaps the most important component in React Router. To understand and learn it well, its most basic responsibility is to render some UI when a location matches the route path. So again, switch, I may have jumped the gun on that a little bit. Switch relies on routes, so that's why we kind of jumped into routes a little bit sooner, but at the end of the day, routes, the way they work is they're just going to try and find that location, and they're going to just render that component. So in this instance, you could see that they do have exact path. So there's kind of like a catch right here, making sure that if the exact path is /, then render this. Otherwise, if the route is /news, then you can go ahead and render that. But typically you want to do all of this in your app.js because it's more like your controller for all your routes, and that'll make it a lot easier. But this is possible as well inside of like nested components and so on and so forth.
So instead of doing like the Express server-side stuff, we're doing it on the client side now?
It depends, because if you're using Redux, you could use like run the question by me one more time. I didn't get a lot of sleep.
Before we were using Express, so if someone requests like the page news, that the server would send them the whole page with all the templates in Ajax. So now we're going to just do all that rendering on the client side and do like an API call to our Java server.
Exactly. So this is meant for like front, if you're a front end engineer, this is the kind of stuff that you'd be doing where it's like I'm creating all these routes on my front side client application. And then what you would do is if you had Redux, I'm trying to think of a way to do it in React, but I don't want to try and go into that right now. But I know for a fact with Redux, you have the reducers and you have the actions, and that way you can use it to actually go and query servers and so on and so forth. But yeah, when you actually are using Redux and you have like the controllers and the actions, that's when you can send API calls with those actions to your server. So this would work with a Java app as long as your APIs are set up to correspond with how you're calling them and your actions with your controller and your reducer. I don't know how possible this is with React. I'm sure it is, but it's probably a little more rudimentary where you're actually just throwing in the link and then like the server's listening for that link and then maybe you can do something with that. I've never really messed around with that, but that's definitely something to look into. Does that help a little bit?
Oh yeah, I'm just trying to like, see what the difference is between what we were doing and like what we're doing now.
Yeah. So pretty much what we would be doing in order to hit our database is we would have some sort of function call, some sort of like try catch, an asynchronous HTTP request, and then once that resolves, then you can go ahead and pull that data in, store it in your prop, something like that. That would be a good way to do it. But with Redux, it's a little bit easier because you just throw all that into your actions, but there's a lot of stuff you can do with React. So it's really up to you. I personally like using Redux. I highly recommend if you guys have the time to take a look at it. But another one we're going to be looking at is redirect. So redirect is special because it's meant to be somewhat of a conditional rendering. You might see this like exactly, this is a pretty good example. So we're saying we want to go to this route and then we're going to render, but then we have a ternary right here. So is it logged in, true or false? This is a Boolean. If it's true, then we skip ahead. If it's true, then we redirect to dashboard. Else, we want to send them back to the home page. It's kind of like authentication, right? So you could use a redirect to kind of conditionally render based upon, a variable being true or false, right? Conditional rendering. So redirect is something that you would want to do if, the user isn't logged in. You want to send them back to your home page instead of just allowing them to go to their dashboard, right? So that's the purpose of redirect. It's meant to check for authentication typically, and I'm sure there's a couple other applications, but generally that's probably what you're going to be using it for. It's just to check that people are logged in or have a session before you actually send them to where they're supposed to go. Cool. And so this one is not required by you guys in any sense, but the demo I'm about to show you doesn't necessarily work without it. So it's a little complicated, but it's essentially using Redux where you're able to connect your store and your props and have it conditionally render based upon the way your props change. So the demo I'm about to show you guys, the guy that did this project, he ended up using Redux with Router, and so instead of having a lot of stuff linking to other things, some of his functionality is actually, he'll change a prop, and since the prop gets changed, it dispatches an action, changes the state, and then when that component comes back and it gets that new state change, then it will either redirect you somewhere else, such as after you're logged in, or all sorts of things, right? So I don't want to get too much into this, but I just wanted to show it because you guys will see it in the demo. Speaking of which, so down here, I will pull this up, and what we got going on here is just our typical index.js and a React app, right? So in your React app, what you might want to do is do the thing I was talking about before, where you're importing the browser router as just router. And so this is an index.js. So what he decided to do was just wrap his entire app in the router. So that way, when we go over to app, what he's able to do is he's able to have his top nav always at the top, but then with this switch statement, he's able to just input these routes without having to worry about the browser router wrapping any of those routes. So that's browser router right there. I think it's good practice to try and wrap it in your app because then you have access to it anywhere. Makes it a lot easier. And then, yeah, we can see our switch statements here, right? We have a route path. We have a route exact path, and then we can see right here, this is kind of like a conditional. This isn't a redirect, but you can see right here redirect to login if the exact path is the /. So this is what's going to cause our app when we spin it up to actually just take us to the login page and not just to like /. So I'll show that to you guys in just a second. And that's our app.js. You can see here he did decide to use with router, so there is some functionality where he's changing the state of user, and that's actually re-rendering his components. And so finally we have link. So again, these are very basic, and this is in his top nav component. So if we scroll down, this is where we finally see links because they're very rudimentary, and we want these links to actually be hitting things that we have set inside of our app route. So if we come over here, we see login, we see sign up, and we see profile, right? So if we come over here, we see login, sign up. There's probably right here. This is because of with router down here. Map dispatch to props. Okay, so it's the child component up here. But basically, the reason that this is able to work is because of this right here, with router. So with router is in app.js, which is obviously rendering everything else. So then, because the parent's already using, pardon me, with router, then we have access to it in top nav. And so that's why up here we can just use this on-click this.props.logout because it's being wrapped with that with router. So it's listening for state change, and then you can see he has some conditionals right here, like is logged in. So ternary, if they are logged in, then we can go ahead, have this logout component render with the on-click function that changes the state. But other than that, it's just, you know, a link to this, a link to that. Are there any other links on the page? I don't think so. So that is essentially everything I just showed you guys. I'll bring it back. All you need to do in order to pass this is you need browser router, we showed that. You need switch statements in your app, so that way your routes work appropriately. We have our routes, which is what you actually want to put inside of your switch statements. Links are meant to be like self-contained. I see these the most often in like nav bars and stuff like that because it's just it's not a route. You don't want to make it a route because then you run into that problem where it needs to be wrapped in a switch and so on and so forth. So if you know exactly where you want to go, it's probably better to just use link. So that way you can just send them right to where you want them to go. So like if you had an about page, you just do link to about page, it gets them to the about page, right? We went over router, and we went over redirect again. That one was a little basic, but this is essentially how it boils down to at the end of the day is it's a conditional rendering, and this is a good way to like make sure that people are properly authorized before you send them to a specific route, essentially. And so, yeah. That's all I have for you guys. Like I said, it was a little basic. I just kind of went through some of the most important React DOM stuff. I'm going to send this out. This is the documentation for browser router if you wanted to look a little bit more in depth on that. Switch, link, route, redirect, and with router. And I actually have included this gentleman's project because I just stole it from my demo. So when I share the slides, you guys will come over here. This guy is an absolute genius, and so if you wanted to, you could go ahead and clone this and bring it down and just take a look at how he did everything, just so that way you can kind of get your eyes on a very well done checkpoint, because this guy, before coming to Galvanize, had a 4-year degree from MIT for engineering. So and then he had experience with Java, so like this guy was like far above all of us in our class, so that's why I picked his project in particular. He's super awesome, and if you want to look into this and see exactly what he did, it's in my slides right here. I just clicked on that again, so I'll send this out so you guys have a reference to that. Other than that, are there any questions?
Have you ever had anyone ask React questions in an interview?
The only job I've ever had is this one. So, I think it's probably good to know. I really don't think that would come up in an interview. I feel like more computer science or like abstract thinking, like hard problem solving, lateral puzzle type things are more common in interviews. I think it would be pretty rare somebody just would randomly bring up like, how does browser router work? Unless you're like trying to apply for like an only React workshop, like where they're only front end or something, like maybe then you would want to, obviously do your research for where you're applying. If they're if they're like an Angular workshop, like they're not gonna expect you to do that.
Yeah, my friend did a React interview at American Express, and they asked a lot of React questions, but I haven't heard React Router questions come up.
Yeah, they're probably just talking about like the life cycles. They might be asking more broad questions like, so where does componented mount come into the React lifecycle, those sorts of things, like more broad general questions, I think is probably what they would be asking, but it's probably good to get familiar with all these things anyway. And then later on in the week, we'll be talking about React hooks. So I'll start working on that PowerPoint myself, but yeah. Any other questions, Clarence?
Does link eliminate the need for the HTML and
No. That's what I just showed you guys. So like right over here with link, you throw that in, you import it. This is like horrifically small. Where'd you go? I miss you so. Link, where am I link? There we go. Okay. Sorry about that. Yeah, this is it's a React component. Pardon me, a React router DOM component. So that's why we're importing it specifically from there, and that's why it's not a lowercase l, because this is a React component essentially at the end of the day, or React functionality. This is different than like a link tag in HTML and a tag in HTML, because those are obviously not React components, and so they don't have the same functionality. The biggest takeaway here is to make sure this L is capitalized, because maybe if you were going back and forth between pure HTML or something like that, obviously you would run into a problem where you have a lowercase link and then an uppercase link, right, or whatever. So this is purely React right here. You're never going to run into any sort of like confliction problems as long as you write it right here, just like that. Did I help answer your question? A little bit? Okay. Any other questions? Awesome. All right, thanks guys. I appreciate it. I'll stop the recording. I'll make sure